Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Hillary Justice, the Hemingway Program Specialist here, and on behalf of Stephen Rothstein, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and James Roth, Acting Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, our welcome to the 2017 PEN Hemingway and PEN New England Awards. Permit me just a few moments to gesture in acknowledgement to all of those who make this event possible, and on behalf of the many sponsors listed in your programs, many of whose representatives and leaders are present and join all of us in welcoming you for today's joyful celebration. The Hemingway Family Prize, the Hemingway Foundation and Society, the U-Cross Foundation, and the University of Idaho deserve special mention here. Another special acknowledgement to PEN New England, including Helen Atwan and Karen Wolf, with whom we are proud to collaborate on this and other efforts to help promote arts and literature locally and globally, and to the distinguished judges for all of these awards, about whom you will hear more later. Finally, to my colleagues here at the Kennedy Library and Kennedy Library Foundation, whose pleasure it is to work to make this day special, especially Liz Murphy and Signa Lindberg. We are delighted to have members of the Hemingway family here with us. Carol and Patrick Hemingway, the guiding force for the Ernest Hemingway collection, the world's repository for the majority of Hemingway's papers, photographs, and mementos, which it's our honor to archive, to preserve, and to steward for generations to come. Our debt to Patrick and Carol for their generosity and support of efforts to champion Hemingway's legacy goes beyond words. We're also joined by Sean and Colette Hemingway, co-chairs of the Hemingway Council, which raises funds for and awareness about the collection. Colette has written passionately about Hemingway and his art collection, and it's been our tremendous pleasure to assist Sean as he edits his grandfather's works. Hemingway's great-grandchildren, Rob and Anouk, are here this year as well. A few words on issues of writing: language, place, time, and family. When she accepted her Nobel Prize in 1993, Ohio-born Chloe Wofford, whom most of us know as Toni Morrison, said she went into the ceremony very conscious of the writers who had come before, but while she was there, she felt a growing excitement about the achievements of those who would come after her. Those who, she said, even as I speak, are mining, sifting, and polishing languages for illuminations none of us have dreamed of. In her Nobel lecture, she offered a parable of a wise woman learning to trust a group of children more interested in their own voices than in her teaching. But from them she comes to understand. Morrison wrote, "Be it grand or slender, burrowing, blasting, or refusing to sanctify, whether it laughs out loud or is a cry without an alphabet, the choice word, the chosen silence, unmolested language surges toward knowledge. Word work is sublime," the wise woman thinks, because it is generative. It makes meaning that secures our difference. In the 1920s in Paris, another wise woman was instructing her own flock of hopeful young writers, including one born where the city of Chicago meets the American prairie. That wise woman was Gertrude Stein, born in Oakland, California, of which she famously said, "There is no there there." And she told her student, Ernest Hemingway, that he could never hear the language of his place home until he lived away from it, away being where other languages not his own would fill his ears. Her lesson was designed to fit her own personal challenge. Quote, "There is one thing one has to remember about America. It had a certain difficulty in proving itself American." Her purpose as a writer was to provide this proof, to wrest American English from English English, and conclude its succession and its difference in her own mastery of its separateness. And in 1929, her student Hemingway joined her in declaring the pastness of the past, stating in A Farewell to Arms that old world words like sacred, glory, and sacrifice had been co-opted by propagandizing bill posters, gutted of truth. Hemingway wrote that to war's survivors, only the place names where battles had been fought and comrades fell held any meaning. Like Morrison's wise woman, Stein eventually realized the truth of her former student's lesson. When, after years under Nazi occupation, her village welcomed the first American troops, she wrote in her journal, "They came from Colorado. Lovely Colorado. I do not know Colorado, but that is the way I felt about it. Lovely Colorado. How we talked, and where they were born was music to the ears. Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., and Detroit, and Chicago. It is all music to the ears, so long away from the names of the places where they were born. In her epilogue to this journal, which would be her last published writing, Stein finally admits what Hemingway always knew, the generative qualities of place. After all, she wrote, anybody is as their land and air is. Anybody is as the sky is low or high. Anybody is as there is wind or no wind there. That is what makes a people. Their kind of thinking, their subtlety, and their stupidity, and their language. Hemingway's own take on the relationship between language and place, space, and time transcends Stein's ultimate confession that the past might be kind of important, Hemingway reaching instead for eternity. Likening time to the Gulf Stream, which he tells us subsumes the palm fronds of our victories and the worn light bulbs of our ideas, Hemingway writes in Green Hills of Africa that a country finally erodes and the dust blows away. None of a country's people were of any importance permanently, except those who practiced the arts. Or, as his successor Norman Maclean would say, in tacit homage to Hemingway and to all other great writers, the river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over rocks from the basement of time. On some of the rocks are timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs. I had to use a Montana fisherman to introduce another one. Today, some of those other words, his father's, will be shared by Patrick Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway's son and the editor of his father's other major Africa work, True at First Light, as well as advisor to his nephew Sean's expanded Hemingway library editions, as well as champion of the ongoing Hemingway Letters Project and the Ernest Hemingway Collection. Like Stein, Patrick once claimed California as home base, beginning his university education at Stanford, but then showing the inestimably excellent judgment to relocate to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he completed his degree in history and literature at Harvard. From there, his adventures took him to Africa, where he qualified as a safari leader and wildlife management expert, working for the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Since retiring from the UN, he has lived in Bozeman, Montana, with his wife Carol Hemingway, where he oversees Ernest Hemingway's copyrighted intellectual property in traditional and emerging media here in the United States and worldwide. Please join me in the tremendous honor of welcoming Patrick Hemingway.
Well, those of you who have been here before, and it's been several times, I guess, you're used to me reading something from my father's distinguished work, and this time I'm going to depart from that a little and just read from an introduction that he wrote for an anthology on war called Men at War. And it wasn't published by Scribner's, and I remember Mr. Scribner really always ignored it as though it never existed because he hadn't published it. But it's still in print through a variety of publishers. But the introduction has had a curious history. As he wrote it, you can only see it in the very first edition of Men at War. In subsequent editions, it was cut in 9 different places. And what I'm going to read is one of the things that was cut. And the reason I chose it was really for family reasons, because it led to a very embarrassing position for my older brother, who was a soldier in the Second World War and was in a sort of tight spot as a result of what my dad wrote. It begins, "When this war is won, though Germany should be so effectively destroyed that we should not have to fight her again for 100 years, or if it is done well enough, forever. This can probably only be done by sterilization. This act can be accomplished by an operation little more painful than vaccination, and is easily made compulsory. All members of Nazi Party organizations should be submitted to it if we are ever to have more than a breathing space between wars. No matter how we win the war, no matter what peace is imposed, if this is not done, there will be another war as soon as the beaten Nazis can reorganize for it. They can always organize for it since their conquerors go by certain rules of observance and the Germans go by none. It is not wise to advocate sterilization now as a government or allied policy, since it can only cause increased resistance. So I do not advocate it. I oppose it, but it is the only ultimate settlement. Now, this and some other alarming passages in his introduction were cut out, and no one seems to know whether he cut them out himself or whether they were cut out by editors of subsequent editions of the book. But what is amusing is that his eldest, by the way, this is the only Hemingway book that's dedicated to his children. And what happened was that my older brother, Jack, he parachuted into the south of France to organize the French resistance because he was brought up in France and could speak French very well. And luckily, he was taken prisoner rather early and in uniform, because if he'd been out of uniform, he would have been shot as a spy. But he was wounded in the shoulder and taken prisoner and sent to a prison camp in Germany, where also the son of Joseph Stalin was imprisoned. And there's a horrible picture of Stalin's son subsequently trying to escape, hanging dead off the wire around the encampment. So Jack, having known what his father wrote, and somehow it had changed from sterilization to castration, was very worried indeed. But he received probably as good treatment as anybody else in the camp. But when he was released, he weighed only 96 pounds. And when he'd enlisted, he weighed 180. So I just thought that would be a fun thing to read. And I just wanted to share it with you, because this anthology, Men at War, is still in print. It's very, very much liked by the military. I was complimented on it not too long ago from two very big Navy SEALs who said they really enjoyed the book. So that's about it. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Helen Elaine Lee, one of the 3 judges of this year's PEN Hemingway Award. I'm honored to present the awards, and I was honored to work with my fellow judges, Jim Shepard and Andrea Barrett, who are unable to be here today. I must say that it was a pleasure to serve as a judge, to be immersed in fiction for a month and a half. In these dark political times, I'm even more aware of the transformative power of literature, of the light that it can provide. There were so many wonderful novels and story collections submitted this year. The process of judging was exciting and rigorous, and PEN New England's executive director, Karen Wolf, made it happen, made it a great experience, so many thanks to her. We judges admired so many of the books we read, and especially this year's winner, finalists, and honorable mention. So I will first announce the two honorable mentions. The first is to Callan Wink for his short story collection, Dog Run Moon, published by Dial Press. And he is unable to be with us today, unfortunately. And the second is for Melissa Yancey, author of a short story collection, Dog Years, published by the University of Pittsburgh Press. Please stand, Melissa. Okay, and so next I'm going to read the citations for the two finalists. And the first is for Bill Beverly, author of the novel Dodgers. Bill Beverly's outstanding debut novel traces a young man's odyssey from his gang's Los Angeles neighborhood to a nightmarish Rust Belt town where the paintball range offers the only solace. His hero, as intelligent and responsive as a young de Tocqueville, makes us see in a new way a heartland torn by racial tension and rural despair. But although the novel's events are dire, Beverly has such understanding of his characters, such control of pace and tone, and such a taut and resonant prose style that Dodgers, like all realized works of art, becomes truly exhilarating. Welcome to the stage, Billy. Should we go over? Should we take one? Yes, yes. The other finalist is Leopoldine Kaur, and she wins for her short story collection, When Watched, published by Penguin. When Watched renders the particular desperations of its varied and affecting protagonists with wit and an astute observational eye. Leopoldine Kaur writes arrestingly well about characters continually stunned, despite themselves, at their inability to fully enact the connections that seem so imminent. And she's insightful about the tenderness for ourselves that we retain almost involuntarily, even as we register our more menacing and enduring self-destructive impulses. This is a collection that acknowledges with an appealing and stubborn generosity the woeful, the needy, and all those scorned by others' lack of regard. Congratulations. And finally, the citation for the winner, who is Yaa Gyasi, author of the novel Homegoing, published by Alfred A. Knopf. Yaa Gyasi's towering novel, Homegoing, is the kind of book we pray for, even as it renders us heartbroken and outraged. As is true of all exceptional literature, this book makes us see differently. Through resonant evocations of place and social context, compelling and intertwining narrative threads, and characters who are multidimensional and unforgettable, Gyasi brings alive the tangled web of the Atlantic slave trade and reveals its ravages on both sides of the ocean. Imaginative, artful, and striking in its insight and scope, Homegoing captures the complex and painful truths of a history and an inheritance that continue to shape all of our lives. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you to Patrick and Carol. Thank you to the judges, and congratulations to all of my fellow honorees. I just feel kind of stunned every day that I get to do this, and so I'm grateful to everyone who's read the book, and thank you again. I've been asked to read, so I'm just going to read a little bit from the very beginning of the novel. Homegoing is a novel that follows the family lineage of two half-sisters. Afia, the first half-sister, is the wife of the British governor of the Cape Coast Castle, which is a slave fort that still stands in Cape Coast, Ghana. Essie, the second half-sister, is kept in the castle as a slave before being sent to America. And the novel follows down the line, descendant after descendant, ending in present-day America. And so this is from Afia's chapter. The night Afia Otre was born into the musky heat of Fanti land, a fire raged through the woods just outside her father's compound. It moved quickly, tearing a path for days. It lived off the air. It slept in caves and hid in trees. It burned up and through, unconcerned with what wreckage it left behind, until it reached an Ashanti village. There, it disappeared, becoming one with the night. Afia's father, Kobi Otre, left his first wife, Baba, with the new baby, so that he might survey the damage to his yams, that most precious crop known far and wide to sustain families. Kobi had lost 7 yams, and he felt each loss as a blow to his own family. He knew then that the memory of the fire that burned, then fled, would haunt him, his children, and his children's children for as long as the line continued. When he came back into Baba's hut to find Afia, the child of the night's fire, shrieking into the air, he looked at his wife and said, "We will never again speak of what happened today." The villagers began to say that the baby was born of the fire, that this was the reason Baba had no milk. Afia was nursed by Kobi's second wife, who had just given birth to a son 3 months before. She would not latch on, and when she did, her sharp gums would tear at the flesh around the woman's nipples until she became afraid to feed the baby. Because of this, Afia grew thinner, skin on small bird-like bones with a large black hole of a mouth, which expelled a hungry cry that could be heard throughout the village, even on the days Baba did her best to smother it, covering the baby's lips with the rough palm of her left hand. "Love her," Kobi commanded, as though love were as simple an act as lifting food up from an iron plate and past one's lips. At night, Baba dreamed of leaving the baby in the dark forest so that the god Nyame could do with her as he pleased. Afia grew older. The summer after her 3rd birthday, Baba had her first son. The boy's name was Fifi, and he was so fat that sometimes when Baba wasn't looking, Afia would roll him along the ground like a ball. The first day that Baba let Afia hold him, she accidentally dropped him. The baby bounced on his buttocks, landed on his stomach, and looked up at everyone in the room, confused as to whether or not he should cry. He decided against it, but Baba, who had been stirring benku, lifted her stirring stick and beat Afia across her bare back. Each time the stick lifted off of the girl's body, it would leave behind hot, sticky pieces of benku that burned. By the time Baba had finished, Afia was covered with sores, screaming and crying. From the floor, rolling this way and that on his belly, Fifi looked at Afia with his saucer eyes, but made no noise. Kobi came home to find his other wives attending to Afia's wounds and understood immediately what had happened. He and Baba fought well into the night. Afia could hear them through the thin walls of the hut where she lay on the floor, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. In her dream, Kobi was a lion and Baba was a tree. The lion plucked the tree from the ground where it stood and slammed it back down. The tree stretched its branches in protest, and the lion ripped them off one by one. The tree, horizontal, began to cry, red ants that traveled down the thin cracks between its bark. The ants pooled on the soft earth around the top of the tree trunk. And so the cycle began. Baba beat Afia. Kobi beat Baba. By the time Afia had reached age 10, she could recite a history of the scars on her body. The summer of 1764, when Baba broke yams across her back. The spring of 1767, when Baba bashed her left foot with a rock, breaking her big toe so that it now always pointed away from the other toes. For each scar on Afia's body, there was a companion scar on Baba's, but that didn't stop mother from beating daughter, father from beating mother. Matters were only made worse by Afia's blossoming beauty. When she was 12, her breasts arrived, 2 lumps that sprung from her chest as soft as mango flesh. The men of the village knew that first blood would soon follow, and they waited for the chance to ask Baba and Kobi for her hand. The gifts started. One man tapped palm wine better than anyone else in the village, but another's fishing nets were never empty. Kobi's family feasted off of Afia's burgeoning womanhood. Their bellies, their hands were never empty. Thank you again.
Hello. Hi, how y'all doing? My name is Jericho Brown. I am a poet. Thank you so much, y'all, for that great reading. That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I am here to present the awards for PEN New England in fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. Before I do that, though, I would like to take a second, because I know she was so patient with me, she must have been patient with everyone else, to give a round of applause and a big thank you to Karen Hurst. Is Karen, where is Karen? Is she in the room? Oh, she's in the back. She's managing people in the back. Thank you so much. Wolf, I'm sorry, Karen Wolf. I'm mixing up Karens. Thank you. So I am really taken by how many people are here and that we're all here for the art of literature. And in particular, I'm taken by the fact that numbers is never what it's about for us as artists. We do not mean to be celebrities. It is never about crowds. Most of the work we do in solitude. And we do that work not in the hope of reaching masses, but in the hope of occupying space in any single human heart. There's been a lot said about prizes and awards and what the value of a prize or an award might be. And it is true that if you are indeed a writer, you will write whether or not you ever win any award. And it is true that if you are indeed a writer, you can win every award and you still have to go home to face your blank page and make some magic happen. But while those things are true, it is also true that there is a thing such as encouragement, that encouragement is real, that there is nothing in the world like hearing from your peers, from the people of this community, that you have indeed done the work that you mean to do. And with that, I give you the winner of this year's award in fiction, Helen Elaine Lee. Oh, I read that wrong. Wrong page. I'm like, what is happening? In fiction, Robin MacArthur, for her book, Half Wolf. Yeah, clap. Half Wild. Half Wild, Stories by Robin MacArthur, is a gorgeous collection. How lovely this language is, and how startling these perceptions. MacArthur, like all good writers, reminds me that a place I thought I knew is also a place I can encounter completely new. The stories are set mostly in the Vermont countryside, in small towns and on struggling farms. These people live in trailers and shabby houses. The hillsides are steep and green, austere and beautiful. The people lead uncertain lives, bare-bone, desolate. They're farmers and drinkers, loggers, hippies and drifters. No one is rich. No one is certain. The weather, the economy, the looks on people's faces, anything can bring you down or lift you up. But this writing will only lift you up. MacArthur's sentences gather steam and glory as they unroll across the page. These scenes are both intimate and sweeping, glorious and unbearable. Like all the best writing, this work feels half wild, half locked deep inside us. And that is the citation by this year's judge, Roxana Robinson. Ladies and gentlemen, Robin MacArthur.
Thank you, Jericho. I just want to say 30 seconds of gratitude. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Roxana. My grandmother, Margaret MacArthur, moved to Vermont to a farmhouse without running water or electricity in the 1940s. She was 19 and pregnant with her first child. And she did not know how to understand this place that she had moved to or the culture, and she knew that the only way to do that was to find the stories of that place. So she spent the next 10 years, she had 5 kids, she would put them in her Jeep Willie and drive back roads, collecting songs and stories on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. And I consider this book a continuation of her work, and so I accept this in her honor, and also in the honor of my children here, Ava and Owen, who have been with me every step of the way with this book. Thank you all.
and in poetry for the book Standoff by David Rivard. David Rivard's Standoff is a beautiful book of political elegies. At the same time that the speaker laments his father's death and praises opportunities for solitude, he positions himself as a man with an identity, a history, a region, a nation. Quote, "So, if you're looking for reparations, you'd best look somewhere else. We don't believe in cheating, but we often cook the books. Each of us has woken at night and felt himself an immigrant still." Close quote. The humor in this book is a biting one, and Rivard is strong enough a poet to know that the best meal is made when he hungers after the truth of himself. This isn't a project. This is a collection of poems meant to show how the world leaves us fragmented. Poems united here to remind us how we nevertheless continue whole. And that is the citation for David Rivard from Judge yours truly, Jericho Brown.
I actually wrote a page and a half full of comments, but I'm not going to give them, thank God. About 20 years ago, I was at a similar ceremony in New York at the Academy of American Poets. I was being awarded a prize for my second book. In the green room before the ceremony, the great American poet Adrienne Rich was there. She was the first poet I ever heard read in the mid-1970s. It completely changed my life. I had a conversion experience. I had never written a poem. I had not had an interest in reading poems much before that point. My life as a poet began then and there. And I went up to her, I knelt by her chair and told her all that. I was a kid from a working class city in Massachusetts. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I told her all of that, and she thanked me for telling her, and she said, "You know, you're very lucky to have been able to make a life doing this thing that you love." And I was so amazed and appreciated hearing that. It's the absolute truth. Moments like this reaffirm that over and over again. I'm so grateful for the community of writers that I live in Boston and Cambridge. I can't imagine being the writer that I am without them. I'll just say thank you to Jericho for those beautiful, beautiful words. His work inspires me, you know, and he's one of the poets who I measure my work against. This is for my mom, who's here today. Thank you so much, everyone.
And finally, our award in nonfiction goes to Matthew Desmond for his book, clap, 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 for his book Evicted, Poetry and Profit in the American City. I'm thinking about poetry, of course. Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City. A book is a contraption for delivering meaning, and its worth relies on both these things: the soundness of the contraption, a vessel built for prose, and the merit of its cargo, its story. Matthew Desmond is an excellent craftsman. With unflinching particularity, Evicted brings to life and then ably navigates some very rough terrain, but for all that he holds us wrapped with a powerful narrative. Desmond's greater achievement is never letting craft outshine meaning. The work he has done as a journalist, as a historian, as an ethnographer, the commitment he has made as a thinker, a searcher, a questioner, a citizen and fellow human being, animates every page of this morally urgent book. He is that rare thing, an artist who is also a social healer. He writes with a sense of proportion that allows the storytelling to remain always in the service of something larger, the story. And that is the citation by Leah Hager Cohen for Nonfiction, Matthew Desmond.
Thank you so much, Jericho. Thank you, Leah, for that beautiful write-up. This is a very special one for me. As all the writers and artists in the room know, this is a team effort, and I have this amazing Boston-based team. And I'd like to thank Jill Neeram, my amazing agent, Amanda Cook at Crown, my editor, who's also Boston-based, and of course my family, Sterling and Walter and Tessa, who are here today. Thank you so much for supporting this work. I want to dedicate this award to you guys, but I also want to remind you that we don't work for trophies. We work because we believe in the thing we do. Evicted is a book about 8 families who are evicted from their homes in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it follows those families into homeless shelters, into abandoned homes, AA meetings, work, funerals, births, and tries to tell their lives with as much complexity as I'm able to. I've been asked to give a reading, and I'm going to share with you the end of Vanetta's story. The morning of her sentencing hearing, Vanetta rose to her children, fed and dressed them, and began re-ironing her outfit on a living room floor. Besides installing the stove and refrigerator, she hadn't been able to do much else in the apartment and felt empty, unlived in. Kendall joined Vanetta in the living room, standing with his hands at his sides in the tawny glow of the morning. She had dressed him in a red-collared shirt and his new shoes. A few feet away, a picture of him at his preschool graduation in cap and gown was displayed on the mantel. "Mama," Kendall said, "kids aren't supposed to go to court. They're supposed to go to daycare, school." He wasn't pouting. He was observing some strangeness in the world, a misalignment. He could have been saying, "Dogs aren't supposed to like cats," or "It's not supposed to snow in April." Vanetta put down the iron, took a breath. "Kendall, will you come to court with me?" she asked, just as she had the night before. Kendall saw that she needed him. "Mama, I will go to court with you," he said decisively. "If they give Mama the punishment, what are you supposed to do? Stick together, take care of my sister and brother, and listen to my titi." At the last minute, Vanetta had decided to ask her sister to care for her kids if she was sent away. She couldn't say why. Vanetta arrived at court early, quietly shaking under a conservative black sweater and matching slacks. She had put on makeup and earrings and had pulled her hair tight around her head. She paced the hallway, trying to think of what she would say to the judge, periodically stopping to watch the ponderous gait of shackled black men in orange prison uniforms. Shortcake showed up in a knit cap and winter coat, along with Vanetta's twin brother and younger sister. Ebony stayed home to watch Timby and Bobo and the rest of the kids. Later, the preacher's wife and another white woman from the All-Bible Baptist Church, Vanetta's congregation, would join them in knit sweaters and thick glasses. When it was time, Vanetta took a seat next to her public defender, a foot-tapping white man in a plain black suit. The courtroom didn't look like the kind you see on television, those open-air theaters with balconies, large ceiling fans, and people crowded into wooden pews. It was a small space separated from the audience by a thick wall of glass. Ceiling speakers broadcast court proceedings to the onlookers. When it was Vanetta's turn to speak, she took full responsibility for her actions and apologized to the victims of the court. At the time of this situation, me and my kids were going through a difficult time in our lives and on the verge of being evicted and our lights being cut off. I was overwhelmed by the difficulties. But this doesn't excuse what I've done. At this time, I'm asking for leniency for me, but especially for my children. Then it was time for people to speak on Vanetta's behalf. The preacher's wife said, "I've observed in her a quiet calmness in the midst of trying circumstances." Shortcake offered 4 sentences. Vanetta's twin brother said they had just made 21 and that his sister's children needed to wake up next to their mother, not their aunties and uncles. It was the judge's turn. An older white man, he began to recap what he had just heard. So, this was a general discussion about the nature of this offense, basically, that it was an aberration, a crime of desperation. I look at that. But I'm also mindful of the fact that between then and now, nothing has really changed. I'm saying that the overall economic situation hasn't improved. Has it, counsel? No, the public defender said. He had argued that Vanetta had been looking for work. He hadn't pointed out that Vanetta rose at 5 each morning, but still had little time to find a job between searching for a new place to live and attending GED classes and caring for her children, or that employers usually didn't hire people who had recently confessed to committing a felony. No, the judge replied. And quite honestly, I don't know that it's gotten any better after that time. Maybe a little worse, based on what's occurred and the fact that she's kicked around and been moved around. What the judge was saying, in essence, was, we all agree that you were poor and scared when you did this violent, hurtful thing. And if you had been allowed to go on working 5 days a week at Old Country Buffet, refilling soup pots and mopping up frozen yogurt spills, none of us would be here right now. You might have been able to save enough money to move to an apartment that was de-leaded and clean in a neighborhood without drug dealers and with safe schools. With enough time, you may have been able to get Bobo the medical treatment he needs for his seizures, and maybe you could have even started taking night classes to become a nurse, like you always wanted. And who knows, maybe you could have actually become a nurse, like a real nurse with a uniform and everything. Then you could really give your kids a childhood that would look nothing like the one Shortcake gave you. And if you did that, you would walk around this cold city with your head held high, and maybe you would eventually come to feel that you were worth something and deserving of a man who could support you, other than by lending you his pistol for a stick-up, or at least one who didn't break down your door and beat you in front of your children. Maybe you would meet someone with a steady job and get married in a small church with Kendall standing proudly up front by the groom, and Timby is the poofy-dressed flower girl, and Bobo is the grinning, toddling ring-bearer, just like you had always dreamed it. And from that day on, your groom would introduce you as my wife. But that's not what happened. What happened was that your hours were cut, and your electricity was about to be shut off, and your children were about to be thrown out of your home, and you snatched someone's purse as your friend pointed a gun at her face. And if it was poverty that caused this crime, who's to say you won't do it again? Because you were poor then, and you are poor now. We all see the underlying cause. We see it every day in this court. But the justice system is no charity, no jobs program, no housing authority. If we cannot pull the weed up from the roots, then at least we can cut it low at the stem. The judge sighed. A silent moment passed. The court stenographer studied her hands above the keys and waited. Kendall, asleep on Shortcake's lap, breathed noiselessly. The judge ruled, "This is not a probationary case. I am going to impose 81 months in the state prison system." The bailiff approached Vanetta and told her to stand to be handcuffed. "Oh, God," Shortcake let out. She shook Kendall awake and took him to the glass. "Wave goodbye, son." Hands behind her back, Vanetta turned around, tears streaming down her cheeks. Kendall stared back, stone-faced, strong, just like his mama had taught him. Thank you.
Wow. Just want to take a moment to breathe. That was really amazingly powerful, as was Yaa's reading. I think we're very lucky to be here today to celebrate these wonderful writers and to hear some of their words. It's an astounding afternoon. And like most Hemingway and PEN New England Prize days, it's a beautiful day as well. So, I'm Helen Atwan. I'm the administrator of the PEN Hemingway and proud member of PEN New England. PEN New England celebrates great writing all year long, but today is always very special. We also defend free speech and a free press. In my day job as director of Beacon Press, where speaking truth to power has been the tradition for some 164 years, we join other small independent presses in trying to lift up the voices of the marginalized and make every voice heard. I treasure both of these roles, which brings me to my happy job today, which is introducing a writer who has always represented both excellence in her writing and passion in her defense of the rights of writers and readers. John F. Kennedy, when he was taking a beating in the press after the Bay of Pigs, was asked if he resented the media. He said this: "It is never pleasant to be reading things that are not agreeable news, but I would say that it is an invaluable arm of the presidency, as a check, really, on what is going on in the administration. Even though we never like it, and even though we wish they didn't write it, and even though we disapprove, there isn't any doubt that we could not do the job at all in a free society without a very, very active press." Named by Jonathan Yardley of the Washington Post as one of our finest writers, Roxana Robinson is the author of 8 books of fiction and a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. Her fiction addresses social issues such as environmental damage and the consequences of war. Her most recent work, Sparta, was described as a riveting and important contribution to the literature of the Iraq War and to anti-war literature in general, and went on to win a boatload of awards, as have many of her wonderful novels, including Cost, which focused on the devastating consequences of addiction, and her 3 powerful story collections, all lavishly and deservingly praised. Notably, Roxana Robinson has served on the boards of PEN American Center and the Authors Guild, which is the oldest writing organization in America. She served as president of the Authors Guild from 2014 through 2017, having just recently stepped down. And in that capacity, and in her role as an outspoken supporter of social justice, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, she has been to protests, and she has been to the halls of Congress, and above all, she has been using her mighty pen to speak truth to power. I'm proud to present Roxana Robinson.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I can't say how proud I am and honored I feel to be part of a celebration like this. All of you in the room who are writers, I know we all know how important it is to feel that the world hears us and the world knows what we're doing. And since we work in silence and solitude, to hear a response is really essential. So thank you, PEN New England, and thank you to the Hemingway Foundation and to the JFK Library. All of you are tremendously important. I've already just said what I'm about to read, so just forgive me, I got carried away. Writers work in solitude, so response is important to us. If you drop a stone into the well, and if you lean over to listen, and if you never hear a splash, you will never know if what you sent into the world had any weight at all, which is why encouragement is so essential, and why what PEN New England does is so important. This support that Hemingway and the library and PEN New England gives is also important because writers are facing increasingly difficult times on a practical level and on a larger metaphysical level. So I'm going to talk a bit about what the crises are that we're facing and different ways of dealing with them. So we'll talk first about the practicality of being a writer. Let's acknowledge the fact that our incomes are declining drastically. Piracy is rampant, and copyright is at risk. A big shift is taking place, and the money which used to go to creators, which is tech speak for writers, now goes into the coffers of big tech companies. The prices of books are being driven down so that the perceived value of a book has declined in the view of the public. If Amazon tells you that a book is only worth $1.99, after a while you start to believe it. But a writer can't sustain a career if a book she spent 12 years writing sells for $1.99. The tech companies make no distinction between Pulitzer Prize winning biographies and quickie mysteries written in a month. The tech companies want all books to be cheap, and they have so much power over the publishing houses that they're forcing the houses to accept lower and lower prices for the book. Publishers are trapped by this because these companies have monopolies. And at the moment, this changes in terms of political currents, but at the moment, monopolies are not illegal. So the price of books is plummeting, though the cost of writing them is fixed. Writers are told to write for free in order to get exposure. This doesn't happen to other kinds of workers. Why don't you try telling your plumber that he should fix your water heater for free for the exposure it will give him? Writers are treated like hobbyists. Money is being drained from the system that used to sustain them. And if you do publish a book and it's successful, it will be pirated. And the laws against internet piracy are not, at this point, effective. So in some ways, the future seems bleak. And I'll ask you the question. Will writers survive? And I'll tell you right away, yes, we will. There are lots of things we can do. And let me give you, writers, some practical advice on survival. And the most fundamental one is to support your own community. And this means writing checks or using your credit card. Subscribe to the publications that you admire. Pay them money so that they can support their writers. Subscribe to a literary magazine, the kind that you hope will publish your work. Offer it real financial support. Don't expect to read it for nothing. It has to pay its writers. And also, buy books. Buy real books, hardcovers, new ones from independent bookstores. That's really important. This is your community. You want it to support you, and you support it first. Pay it forward. If you love a book, buy a copy for a friend. Books are actually fabulous, cheap presents. But the point is to provide financial support to the community that you hope will support you. Second, this is a little advertisement. Please join the Authors Guild. We really do work for writers. We go to Congress. We talk to them about copyright, about free speech, about piracy, about all these issues that will affect your future. So we have your backs, and we hope you'll join us. So that's one set of threats. That's the practical aspect of being a writer. But there's another one that we face, which is kind of an existential one. And Helen mentioned it. We have put a man in the White House who says that the press is the enemy of the people. He wants to cut off funding for the National Endowment for the Humanities. He thinks basically that a society can get along fine without writers. Have you ever heard of a society that got along fine without writers? No, you have not. A society without writers would be a society without history. We'd never know they were there. But anyway, writers wouldn't permit that. So what happens when the president of this country calls us writers the enemy of the people? Well, what happens is we stand up and resist. When this particular outrage occurred at the Authors Guild, we responded. And what I wrote was, writers, journalists, editors, reporters, novelists, poets, translators, and all those who bear witness to our times are not the enemy of the people. We are the people. We are, right? We are the people. Without a history, we have no future. Without those who bear witness, we are not a society. And a society that claims these witnesses to be enemies is one clouded by shame. So we're not going to permit this kind of injunction to take hold. We are going to resist. So there are different kinds of resistance, and I'll talk about different possibilities. But the central thing that I want to talk about is the writer's mission, the writer's task in the world. And I think that it is to bear witness to the world that we know. Bearing witness is creating history, and bearing witness makes it possible to understand our own lives. Every writer sets down those aspects of the world that are most important. And we've heard in these wonderful readings, aspects of the world that are important to these writers, ones that we never had encountered before. And that's what writers are doing. Maybe those things will be important to the reader right now. Maybe they won't be important for a decade or a generation. And then maybe suddenly they will become a brilliant lens that focuses light on a subject in such a way as to set it on fire. Maybe it will be just a few words. Recently, I heard the writer Ann Patchett give a talk in which she said that years and years ago, she'd been asked to give a talk at a middle school. She says she has no idea what she said in most of the talk, and she doesn't think the students remember. But she said, I ended the speech with one thought. And she said, just remember this, if you remember nothing else. Be kind. Be brave. And afterwards, she heard that the school principal used her words in the daily announcements over the PA. So that for a time, the students at that school heard those words every day. Remember what Ann Patchett said. Be kind. Be brave. Words mean something. They carry a sense of hope and determination and courage. And writers can accomplish things you never thought they would. I was recently in Paris, where I took my granddaughter around, and so I saw touristy places. I went to Notre Dame, and I went to the Cluny Museum, where the unicorn tapestries are. And I learned, to my delight, that both those treasures, those European treasures, had been saved by writers. In the 19th century, Gothic architect was considered grotesque and disgusting, and the Notre Dame was falling apart. The great rose stained glass windows had been replaced by clear glass, and the stones of the building itself were being taken by builders to build other houses. And the writer, Honoré Balzac, thought this was a desecration, and he wrote 11 books about the cathedral, the most famous of which we know as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but in French it's called Notre Dame de Paris. And he drew attention to this masterpiece and saved it. And it's now celebrated as one of the great architectural presences of Europe. The unicorn tapestries were created around 1500. 340 years later, they were discovered hanging on a wall in an old manor house outside in the countryside called Boussac. And Georges Sand and a friend of hers, Prosper Mérimée, both writers, discovered them. They were being gnawed by rats. They were hanging on a damp wall. And George Sand wrote about them. And Prosper Mérimée had friends at the Ministry of Culture, had them declared national treasures, and they were bought by the Cluny Museum, and they are also considered masterpieces in their fields. So let me remind you, writers do stuff. We can change things. And the reason that we can change things is that writers write with passion. So there are other ways that writers can create change, and I think that we look at novels as vehicles into our own lives. Novels will tell us things we never had thought about before, and they allow us to engage with questions that we had never raised ourselves. Every year I teach Anna Karenina in my class at Hunter. I read it every year with my students, and it is wonderful, and I encourage you all to go home tonight, buy a copy from an independent bookstore, and start to read it. One of the central elements in this book, the way I teach it, the way I believe, is the question Tolstoy asks in it. And that question is, how should I live my life? How should I lead a life that I can feel proud of? And Tolstoy thinks in terms of men, because he was a little limited in that aspect. So he just didn't think that women's lives offered as much range, and they didn't actually, as men. So he offers us the four possibilities through the characters of Stiva, Vronsky, Karenin, and Levin. I'm sure you all remember them, but I'll give you a little cliff note. Stiva is the hopelessly irresponsible and amoral husband who starts the book off, remember, all happy families are like. All unhappy families, the unhappy family is Stiva's, because he's just had a fling with the ex-governess. So that's the beginning of the book. It's Stiva's adultery, which ruins the household. Then there's rich, handsome, dashing Vronsky, who starts the whole spiral into destruction of the book by falling in love with Anna. Then there's the poor, benighted and cuckolded husband Karenin, whose ears stick out so fatally from his head. And of course, there is Levin, who's Tolstoy's alter ego. As we move through the narrative, we learn about their flaws first. We understand that we can mock Stiva, who's kind of a fool, and Karenin has those ears. So it's very comfortable for us to sit back, as it always is, and look at other people's flaws and kind of commend ourselves for not having those flaws. We didn't run off with that governess. Our ears don't stick out. So we like to hold ourselves separate from these characters. But Tolstoy, who really does want to know how to live a life to be proud of, will not permit this. Before the end of the book, we have been asked to engage deeply and completely with all of these flawed men. We have been required to sympathize with them. We have come to understand that though their lives are not the ones we've chosen, still these are lives and choices that we can understand. And we must admit that we can read and recognize our own failures through theirs, that we can forgive them their flaws. And we do. We forgive them all their flaws. But it's Levin, Tolstoy's alter ego, who is perhaps the most flawed of all, who engages us most deeply. Levin's answer to this question of how to live a life that he'll feel proud of is to ask questions, to challenge his own motives and his intentions, and he challenges them constantly. He asks himself how he should feel about his dying, reprobate brother, about how he should feel about the people who work on his land. He's a huge landowner. How he should feel about the woman he's about to marry. The relationship to other people is the central moral issue for Tolstoy. And his conclusion is that a moral life requires you to view other people with compassion and with understanding. Honestly, that's it. You still have to read the book, but that is what Tolstoy tells us through this incredible narrative journey, that to lead a moral life means recognizing the humanity in other people. And as a writer, that means writing about characters that you understand, ones that you love. I know that's not in fashion at the moment. We all know about unlikable characters, but I actually think this is essential. I think the art that endures is that which allows us inside other people, and you will only get there by loving them. So what does this mean for us, for you and me? I'm a novelist, and maybe you're a poet or a memoirist. How can we lead our lives as writers in a way that might be useful to others? What difference will our writing make in times of real peril, like those today? How will it change things if we bear witness? Recently, Nicholas Kristof wrote in the New York Times about the importance of the humanities, which are under attack from this administration. He wrote that Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, changed the way white people saw slavery. And Anna Sewell's novel, Black Beauty, changed the way people treated animals. And I think that Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, changed the way people understood our treatment of nature. These books were written by people bearing passionate witness to what they saw around them. They showed us that writing can change the world. It allows us to enter into the lives of other beings, and that can change our view of them utterly. And the world is actually waiting for books that will change it. Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of the best-selling books of the 19th century, and Tolstoy read it, among many others. It was a book driven by a deep sense of empathy and of overwhelming outrage. Stowe was born in Litchfield, Connecticut, where slavery was nearly non-existent, but she moved to Cincinnati when her father became the head of a seminary there. If she'd grown up in Ohio, she might have been accustomed to seeing the miseries of slavery as people tried to escape it. But as a newcomer, Stowe was horrified, and she wrote down her horror and her outrage. Harriet Beecher Stowe was my great-great-great-aunt. Her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, was my great-great-grandfather, the abolitionist minister from Brooklyn. So I've grown up with the belief that you have a moral obligation to set down your ideas, your understanding of the world, to bear witness. Set down the world as you know it, as Hemingway did. Those first great pieces he wrote about the war are some of our most powerful records of that strange state. Share your feelings. If what you feel is outrage, set that down. If what you feel is love and sympathy, set that down. All this makes a difference. As writers, you have the words, and you use them in a way that others don't. That gives you both a power and an obligation. Writers are standing up against this administration. I spent a day in Washington on Capitol Hill with veterans and Muslims, all writers, protesting the Muslim ban. Afterwards, I wrote about it. I was at the Women's March in Washington, which I'm sure many of you were as well. Afterward, I wrote about it. Every time you take an action and write about it, you multiply your presence and your effectiveness. Last fall, right after the election, there was a demonstration in New York at the subway at 14th Street. I didn't hear about it at the time. I knew nothing about it. But people were invited to say something after this shock of the election. So they were given Post-its, and everybody wrote what they wanted to on a Post-it and put it on the tiled walls of the subway station. I didn't know about it until months later. But a few days afterwards, I got on the subway at the 6th line, which goes through 14th Street, and I saw a Post-it on the window. It was above the faces of the people sitting along the side. No one looked at me when I looked at it, so no one on the car had written it. But something was written on it, and I leaned over to see what it said. It said, "Be kind, be brave." Writers are powerful. Words are important. Writers have a great role to play in these times. Write what is in your heart, for that will find its way into the hearts of others. Do what you think is right, for that will make you proud of who you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. I'd like to point out that the Kennedy Library Museum store is independently run. We have several of the books that you heard about today for sale, and I can almost guarantee you that they're more than $1.99. I'm James Roth. I'm the acting director for the Kennedy Library. And on behalf of my colleagues at the library, the foundation, led by Executive Director Stephen Rothstein, the PEN New England, the Hemingway family, and all of our honored guests, thank you so much for coming today. This concludes our program, and it gives me great pleasure to invite you down to our pavilion where we have a public reception. Thank you very much for coming.